That's okay. Now we are recording. Appreciate the presence of everyone here in our fifth edition of Congress for Sustainable Cities. And my name is Josué Mastrode. I'm a professor here at the Pontifícia Universidade Católica de Campinas. And I thank the presence of everyone that came to our Congress this time in an hybrid format and not only online. We have people here at the studio of PUC-Campinas, and we are going to start our Congress with the first lecture of the morning, and I invite Professor Nwauche, Professor Enyinna Nwauche, from the University of Hare to initiate the works of our Congress as our first keynote speaker of the morning. Professor Nwauche he has a PhD in law in South Africa, and I'm glad to have Professor Nwauche as a partner in a joint research on on the new development, the new NBD, the Bank of BRICS, and his lecture is exactly on this subject. Professor Nwauche, I thank you so much for your presence here at PUC-Campinas, although in a virtual form and an online form, but I thank you so much for your kindness, your generosity. Please, the word is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sue. I will try to share the slide, but I think having issues about that. So I'm going to stop sharing so that I can.
We can see the PowerPoints.
Okay, you can. Excellent. Great. Yeah, so I just wanted that to introduce the title. I'm delighted to be part of the conference, and my lecture today will examine the core policy requirement of public consultation as part of the fundamental principles of the BRICS New Development Bank Environmental and Social Policy Framework. The bank, as we know, promotes infrastructural and developmental projects through lending and technical assistance to individuals and also to institutions in BRICS countries and between BRICS countries. The purpose of the NDB, as we know, the purpose of the NDB's environmental and social framework is to ensure that the NDB's approach promotes sustainable development in environmental and social management. The core principles of this framework are an overarching policy for addressing environmental and social management in operations, and secondly, an environmental and social set of standards which set forth mandatory requirements in respect of environment, involuntary resettlement, and indigenous peoples. The bank's environmental and social framework is designed to achieve the following objectives: to manage environmental and social risks and impacts in projects, manage operational and reputational risks of the bank and the stakeholders, mainstream environmental and social considerations into decision-making processes of all parties, encourage international environmental and social practices in its operations, and in doing so, strengthen country systems. Ensure environmental and social soundness and sustainability of projects. Enable clients to identify and manage environmental and social risks and impacts in the bank's projects. Improve development effectiveness and impact to increase results. And facilitate cooperation on environmental and social matters with development partners. Integrating environmental and social interests in its policy and financing of projects ensures that these projects have minimal adverse effects on environment and people. Accordingly, the environmental and social framework of the bank applies to all its financed and administered projects. The bank's policy approach is to anchor the key requirements of environmental and social assessment around national laws, regulations, and regulations of big states. It is thus a process that evaluates the preparation and implementation of projects around national norms, values, and institutions that each of the BRIC states have developed towards environmental and social sustainability. It may be correct to argue that there are no mandatory BRICS environmental and social framework standards. However, if the bank assesses project preparation and implementation as falling below national standards, it engages member states to build an upscale capacity to address these shortcomings. Even though there may not be a mandatory standards from the environmental and social framework of BRICS of the bank, there are a number of policy requirements mandated by the environmental and social framework, including project risks categorization, the conclusion of environmental and social assessment and management plans, public consultations, availability of social and environmental assessment documents, the monitoring and implementation of environmental and social mitigation measures, and the availability of a fair and effective grievance redress mechanisms that appear to be NDB standards and thus applicable to all BRICS states. Whether there is such a standard that is enforceable is part of what this lecture is about. Our concern in this lecture revolves around the principle of public consultation that is organized around these features. The environmental and social framework has public consultation as a core principle. The ESF, the environmental and social framework, in its provision for public consultation, states that the bank requires clients to conduct a meaningful consultation process that is compliant with national laws and regulations and this policy. A consultation that engages with communities, groups, or people affected by proposed projects. A consultation that begins early and is carried out on an ongoing basis. A consultation that provides timely disclosure of relevant and adequate information that is understandable and readily accessible and is undertaken in an atmosphere free of intimidation or coercion. A consultation that is gender inclusive and responsive, tailored to the needs of vulnerable groups, and enables the incorporation of all relevant views of affected people and other stakeholders into decision making. We all know and agree that public participation is important because it improves the quality of decision making through additional knowledge of social and environmental issues, interests, and principles. It fulfills democratic involvement and increases public trust in institutions across all BRIC states, irrespective of their political maturity, their political systems. Generally, we also agree that ideas about public consultation vary from state to state in process and substance because it is a human right in several states and a guide in other states. Even in states where it does not appear to be part of the governance structure, it is one of these principles that are an integral part of public administration. It should take into account the social, cultural, economic, and political circumstances of each state. And one gets the feeling that the manner in which BRICS is organized differs significantly to national circumstances. And this is reflected in the principle of public consultations. Now, how do we know whether the public consultation principle as contained in the environmental and social framework of the bank is adequate, meets international best practices, and assists states and the bank in the financing and technical assistance of projects, I thought we could use the principle of fair, equitable, and productive public participation as a means of judging whether the public consultation principle of the bank is adequate, helps the bank and the member states and the stakeholders in terms of the projects to achieve the sustainable development that is an objective. To evaluate the bank's public consultation principle, it is important to sketch a framework of a globally acceptable public consultation framework. And I've chosen an overarching principle that public participation should be fair, equitable, and productive for the state and the citizens. And of course, that would be a standard that would guide the evaluation of the bank's bank's statement and position on public consultation. A fair and equitable and productive process is dependent on a process that determines who to consult, ensuring inclusivity, representation, and other concerns. Other issues include how we choose the persons, the citizens who are involved. Do we use the potential impact of public policy or use age and socioeconomic circumstances in the selection of the public? We recognize gender and other vulnerabilities as a yardstick for ensuring how we choose the public. If citizens are primary subjects of consultation, it is important to include civil society, including non-governmental organizations, which mobilize and articulate public opinion. Another important aspect of the process is to decide how the public should interact towards democratic outcomes that would also reflect minority views. Calls for comments, public meetings, and consultations are important, even if these mechanisms for arriving at outcomes have to be managed in a fair and equitable manner. Some appropriate considerations include clearly defined details of the participatory process, including date, venue, transport, language to be used, methods of participation, information and documentation, and facilitators for participation. Further questions include how to determine if the report of the outcomes is adequate. It's also essential to manage how outcomes of the public participation influence decision making. The key question is of the report. If the report of the consultation is not binding on the state and the bank, for example, a productive outcome is to explore how to ensure that the outcomes have and will influence public policy. Should the public be reconstituted to consider how their deliberations have impacted public policy? Or is the account of the relevant public authority adequate in this regard, especially if the implementation of the project is over a long period and occurs during political and social change? Having set that framework, as it were, of a fair, equitable, and productive process, I turn now to examine in more detail how the public consultation principle of the bank fares against this standard. Broadly speaking, the bank's norms of public consultations are made up of the processes I've listed before: engagement with stakeholders, consultation within project life cycle, provision of timely, adequate, understandable, and accessible information, gender and vulnerable group inclusivity, and incorporation of stakeholder views into the project decision-making process appear facially to comply with the broad principles of a fair, equitable, and productive public consultation process. It is, however, the fact that these norms take shape within national laws, regulations, and policy that presents considerable challenges for the implementation of the the framework in general and the principle of public consultation. It is certain that public consultations will vary from one BRIC state to another. What Article 22 of the Environmental and Social Framework concerning public consultation is intended to achieve, it can be argued, is to provide minimum standards to guide and evaluate national frameworks. So I go back again to one of the first questions I asked. Are there mandatory norms that guide the bank around which all states must comply? On one hand, the answer could be yes, and yet on the other hand, one sees substantial difference to national circumstances, to national laws and frameworks. The detail that is lacking in arguing that there are minimum standards in the bank's norms that all projects, all states need to conform to can be found in other parts of the environmental and social framework. For example, Article 23 of the framework that deals with transparency and information disclosure provides further details on a key aspect of public consultation, ensuring that social and environmental assessment documents are made available as required by Article 23 promptly in an accessible place in a form of language understandable to affected people and the general public to enable them to make meaningful inputs into the project design and implementation. Is a further elaboration of the framework that appears to be a minimum standards that states, big states, and the bank needs to take into consideration. Another example of how other parts of the environmental and social framework support the public consultation principle is found in Article 24 on monitoring and implementation. That article requires a feedback system that reinforces public consultation, since the bank is required to carry out its due diligence of progress monitoring, report review, field visit, and post-evaluation, and provide support to strengthen the client system. Yet another example is Section 26 of the framework that supports provisions that support the public consultation principle because it mandates a fair and effective grievance mechanisms, which if implemented, will bolster the principle of public consultation. We do know that across several BRIC states, the satisfaction with project implementation leads to protests, disputes, and the ability of the public in general and stakeholders to approach administrative tribunals and the judiciary to review implementation, to review the plans for some of these public projects is a key part of an outcome of public consultation. However, on the other hand, the idea of national oversight of ESF, of the environmental and social framework and public consultation, is reiterated in the policy approach of the ESF, contained in Article 8, that declares that the implementation of the environmental and social framework, including the public consultation principle, is the responsibility of the bank's clients, and that the bank's role is a proactive role by way of ensuring stricter compliance with applicable national standards, working with the client to strengthen country capacity systems, and knowledge sharing with clients on international good practices. So on one hand, the bank seems to put forward the idea that there are minimum standards that banks, clients, BRIC states should conform to in the preparation of project documents and the implementation of the project documents. And yet, on the other hand, the bank says, the bank's social framework says it's up to the BRIC states, and that what they would do would be to step in to ensure compliance with stricter national laws and advice. And one suspects that in practice, this is one way the bank is laying down a line that it would intervene, do so quietly behind the scene. And if you look through the bank's website, there is virtually no information about projects and how these projects are being implemented, whether they've complied with any of the environmental and social frameworks, and what the bank has done, in a sense, to be able to advise, because that's what one gets from the environmental and social framework, that it's an advisory document. The bank wants to advise, to assist, while not putting conditionalities. And many of us here know that one of the challenges of multilateral financial institutions like the World Bank and other institutions was this question of external conditionalities that often were criticized because it didn't take into consideration national circumstances. But for me, it's important to wonder the internal capacity of the bank to fulfill the role set out in Article 8 to ensure that minimum standards of public consultations are met, if we argue on that line. One gets the feeling that there is little political way to implement the ESF beyond what individual big states are prepared to allow. This position appears to be a feature of the philosophy and fundamental structure of BRICS. To strengthen that capacity, to enable the bank to strengthen national capacities and systems, as well as share international best practices, it is recommended that the NDB establishes a non-binding independent accountability mechanism. It is suggested that these independent accountability mechanisms are global best practices used by other multilateral development institutions, including the financial ones. And there are many examples. The review mechanism of the African Development Bank, the accountability mechanism of the Asia Development Bank, the project complaint mechanism of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the independent consultation and investigation mechanisms of the Inter-American Development Bank, and the inspection panel of the World Bank. There's widespread orthodoxy that these binding independent accountability mechanisms of development financial institutions perform an important function of providing a forum for holding development financial institutions accountable for their policies, as well as providing remedies for harm that occurs as a result of the activities. However, since there may be little appetite for a binding independent accountability mechanism in BRICS, a non-binding panel of experts will do so and ensure that the whole perspectives of public participation, such as information, consultation, involvement, collaboration, and empowerment, can be realized, while striving to address the use of external conditionalities and recognize national differences in development capacities. The fundamental objective of public participation should be encouraged. And since one is not sure that there are minimum conditions, and since one is not sure that the bank is willing to report on how it is helping states, the stakeholders, my principal recommendation in the lecture is that a non-binding panel be established, because one is not sure of the capacity of the bank to respond to national peculiarities and advice. In any case, that non-binding panel's report, made public over a number of years, can assist other states in the detailing of how the principle of public consultation can be achieved, can be improved on, and thereby realize the fundamental objective of the environmental and social framework of the bank. Thank you very much.
Professor Nwauche, thanks a lot. Could you hear you in bigger figure now? Thanks a lot for your presentation. I appreciate it very much, and I have many. I would not say considerations, but I would like to provide you some points that I point out here, just for the sake of better discussion. Okay.
Yes, okay.
Okay. I do understand that this is a major point of the new development bank system, because if we now have a development bank that will compete with the World Bank or the other regional development banks, there should be some difference, or a more democratic view, or a more something that will be better for the countries that will receive the loans by the NDB. And I do agree with you that the public consultation principle should be one of the major points. There is something different in the New Development Bank in relation with the World Bank, and this point I agree that is something very sensitive. The NDB wants to loan for infrastructure projects, but one of the consideration, uh, one of the prerequisites to provide the financing is to guarantee that the public or the people that will receive that infrastructure project wanted that. And this will be proved by a very good public consultation system. Am I doing myself? I don't know if I am making myself clear.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
So the problem is not about the principle, but how we enforce that principle.
Yeah.
And I took the liberty to read the article 22 and 23 and all the rest of that document, and I didn't find a very good explanation on how to implement this. Did you find this anywhere else, or do you have any consideration on how NDB understand that this should be implemented?
I don't think NDB is very intent or very deliberate or wants to implement the standards. I think the ambivalence of the NDB on one hand to turn the environmental and social framework to states to implement or to use national laws and um, frameworks as a basis of assessment on one hand, and then on the other hand, it sets the whole of the environmental and social framework can be standards, minimum standards that all big states, all bank customers would conform. But the question is, as you rightly pointed out, is the difficulty in implementation. What is the record of the bank in implementation? And I haven't seen any that is publicly available in an accountable and transparent manner. So you get the sense that the bank just, it just wants to indicate that it's keeping up to best practices because of the sustainable development goals, because of international community's insistence on sustainability. And therefore, it is challenged to do good, even if the bank did not want to implement through minimum standards, even if the bank wants to advise and help bank customers to improve those processes that are in the environmental and social framework. The challenge is whether the bank has that capacity to be able to do that. And for us to know whether the bank is doing that. And this I struggled with. And I thought, well, maybe one way of doing it is to reveal the best practices that have occurred in the different projects that the bank funds across the BRIC states. And there are many of them in all the bank states. There are public infrastructure projects that are on. And often it is in the member states that you get information about what the project is about. But the question is, what are the environmental and social issues, frameworks that have been complied with. For example, in South Africa, there is a huge sanitation project that includes municipalities and cities, massive upgrade of water sanitation systems that really would help cities, South African cities, to enable the citizens to live better. But you know, for those types of projects, you need to make choices. What type of infrastructure you would concentrate on? Is it in delivery? Is it in distribution? How do you do that in a country that is very diverse? And so, in asking South Africans about what they want before the project is implemented would help in publicizing how the South African government and the citizens have viewed these projects, would also help other big states in best practices. So you get to feel this ambivalence that the bank does not want to engage in external conditionalities that is independently reviewed. So yes, the World Bank and other development financial institutions suffered the criticism that the external conditionalities often did not reflect national characteristics, national experiences, and were set by the West as a means of exacting particular development initiatives or ideas. That was a major criticism of the World Bank and the IMF that is still ongoing. So, like you rightly pointed out, so BRICS is the bank is new. What should it do to show that it is new? Is it to abandon the general norms to states, or to try to do something that both reflects national peculiarities but has minimum standards? And that's what you see across the environmental and social framework. There are norms that are, fairly good, conform to international practices. Is the implementation. What is the bank's record in showing us how the environmental and social framework has been approved, has been implemented in different states from the bank's perspective? Because as you know, in the different countries, including Brazil, there's literature and surveys about how, the Brazilian Academy has seen how some of the projects are implemented, but you don't get to see an overarching study about how lending has occurred in preparation and implementation. Thank you.
NDB requires the countries to have a public consultation process, and
Yes.
we understand that each country will inform that the public consultation process has been delivered in a good way. So the criteria to states that if the consultation process was good or not belongs to the states who will receive the funding, not to the NDB.
Yes, well, that's what you get. There's an ambivalence. NDB wants to ensure national standards are met. But how do you do that if you lack capacity? How do you do that if you do not make public what your views are? If a project is ongoing, how do we know that, for example, public consultation has taken place, what the outcomes are? And remember, the essence of the public consultation process is not to criticize the government, it's to help in the implementation of is partly to help in the implementation of the project. The example I gave, which many of us know here, are the choices that are made with respect to those projects. If technocrats, national officials, make choices about how to deliver the projects, are we always sure that they have made the right choices when they've not used the views of the stakeholders, the people who use, for example, the water or the electricity or the roads or the waste removal? So that's the struggle that the NDB has. how to respect national sovereignty and also have regional minimum standards.
Yeah, the point in my view, in my standpoint, is that the technocrats has a point. The technocrats they decide that the funding should be obtained for a project as they design it, and sometimes this is not exactly, or it's not even what people want. And then we have a public consultation process that prevents the framework designed by the technocrats to be implemented. I would like to imagine, or to sometime, to any time, face a situation like that. Here in Brazil, we have a situation related to environmental law. It's not something to be object of funding now, but imagine that Brazil doesn't have money to implement an infrastructure project for obtain petrol oil in the sea, in the shore. It's very near the Amazon River, and imagine that Brazil would like to have a funding for explore this new oil resource. Okay, so we want the NDB to provide us the funding, and then the NDB will ask Brazil to prepare a public consultation process to see if people want to make this funding, to receive this funding. The answer will be no, because we face environmental problems in that place that may cause more harm than health, and the people say no. I'm thinking of the situation that maybe in this case the consultation public will not be. I guess that in the end of the day, this public consultation will not be so strong to prevent NDB to provide the funding in Brazil to make the infrastructure process, because this is something that the economy, people, and stakeholders related to the progress would rather than the people who prefers to use the environmental. How can I say? This may cause harm to the environment. This may cause harm to people who live over there, and I guess that this public consultation will not be so good or so effective to prevent from the infrastructure process to be provided. I don't know
I
if
think
I.
so. All across the world, the public consultation principle is often a mere token process. The public officials undertake it, and the challenge has always been, how do you ensure that the views of people are taken into consideration or just ignored? And the process is just noted. We consulted X people, we've noted their views, but we're still going ahead. In some countries, the public consultation process becomes a contract that is binding, and there is an outcome that the public authority takes into consideration and says, okay, we've spoken to people and we're making X changes to project design, project implementation, and provides a mechanism by which you defend that, you implement that. The way the NDB documents are designed, public consultation will be a mere token. If you allow national states, big states, to determine whether public consultation is adequate, you're effectively saying to the big states, whatever it is that you decide will be okay. And if you look at the bank's practices, I don't know whether anybody has seen any document by the bank reviewing whether the environmental and social framework has been implemented in any bank's lending project, you get the sense that the bank puts out this environmental and social framework just to tick the box. I'm not serious about,
I'm
any
afraid of that too.
Yes.
I'm
But
afraid of
it
that.
can do better, not to enforce it, but to provide best practices. As I said, if some BRIC states lack the capacity to provide technical expertise, now BRICS is expanding, and there are many states who have different levels of national capacities. A project review that is transparent and available outside can inform how some of these states approach similar projects that they want to undertake. You know that international consultancy for lending projects is a huge cost for multilateral development financial institutions. Usually, international experts are hired to advise on lending projects and take a huge chunk of the consultancy because there's lack of national expertise in some of the development projects. So if the bank moves to providing a baseline or a database of ideas or reviews of projects, if the bank sets up a mechanism of experts from BRIC states into a panel or a set of panels that reviews projects and says, okay, this is what you think. You should have taken into consideration X, Y. In the example that you gave of the Amazon, yes, even if people do not want the project, there are many ways of mitigating and advising on how the projects are implemented. Little issues like host community involvement, the nature of involvement, the projects to remedy the environment, the benefits that come from the project to the host communities. There are best practices across the world. Ownership of shares in petroleum extracting companies, payment of dividends, royalties, all kinds of things are possible. But when the bank hides this, is unable to develop these best practices in its review of the design and implementation of the lending projects, it drops many BRIC states of available information they can use to, make their lives better. But you get this sense that BRIC states don't want external review of national projects. Everybody wants to be autonomous.
Yes.
And therefore, we lose sight of that, some of the benefits.
Okay. If you would like to have a co-author to investigate on the public consultation principle as a binding principle, I am assigning, okay?
It's been my pleasure. I hope
Okay.
that we're able to do this thing because you get the sense that if you don't make it binding in different ways, then it's a meaningless process. If you engage people in an area for a period of time in asking their views and they find out that you do not take them serious, after a while, they stop coming. They stop participating because
Yes.
there's institutional memory that this is just a tick the box exercise, and
Yes.
therefore it becomes meaningless.
Yes. In your lecture, you pointed out something that I would like to stress right now. You presented the consultation process whether as a human right or as a guide.
Yes, yes, in
Uh,
some
uh,
states, yes, in some
yeah,
states.
when you say that it's maybe a guide, is a tick the box process or a guide as something that should be considered serious?
I think in some a guide that to be considered seriously and a, a guide that could be enforceable in a court of law. For example, I use the example of South Africa easily. Many legislations have been struck down by the South African Constitutional Court because of the absence of public consultation. The content of that principle is like a guide, because what the courts say in South Africa is that every arm of government should develop what it regards as a reasonable consultation principle. So, for example, the legislature is asked to develop what it thinks is reasonable in consulting stakeholders before a legislation is passed. Public comments, articulation of the outcomes of the public comments, and then a process in which the public comment is worked into the legislation. So if it is a human right, it means that people are able to, stakeholders are able to complain that their rights have been violated, and it can strike down whatever outcomes the public authority is seeking. If it is part of a project and the stakeholders can complain that they were not consulted reasonably, it becomes that process. Where it is a guide, it can be also a basis of review. Have you met this guideline? Which is what the bank's environmental and social framework appears to be now, a guide for big states to use. There is no process of implementation. There's no harm. There's no redress for harm. The other mechanisms I alluded to of the other multilateral institutions, including the World Bank, now has a process in which harm can be remedied if it is shown that some of the conditions for the projects have not been met. There's no such process in the BRICS bank structure. If you feel harm from any BRICS project, you can complain to your national government, and that's it. You're on your own, as it were. So some normative content is perhaps what member states of BRICS can think about. Whether they're able to reach there is the guess of all of us. I don't personally think that we're on that line for the big states or the bank to have minimum norms.
Okay. I use the word too much in this lecture, and I made the unpolite thing to don't open the word to everyone else. Claudio, you raised your hand. The word is yours. Good to see you here. Sim, por favor.
Congratulations, lecture, Professor. And the lecture, you say and discuss about the project policy public, but I would like to know regarding the principles, the consideration about project risks to environmental. How can the NEDC can advise or suggest or go to against the investment or suggest more protection investment to the environment? Is it possible? Is not possible? The country can agree, can not agree about the protection, the new project. For example, if the bank suggests more insurance to that.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Yeah. Yes, sir, can I get a sense of what the question is? If it was not very clear from here.
You didn't answer the question.
Yeah. Could you tell me what, because it wasn't very clear in audio.
Please, Claudio, please ask the question.
What? A respeito dos princípios sobre
No, you can hear me. The question is,
yes, go ahead.
The question is on if the bank can suggest which investment should be provided, and if the bank could be at provide not only the suggestion for the investment, but also to suggest how to proceed the consultation process.
Yes, that's actually my suggestion. That the bank has a role, not in enforcing the norms, but in giving technical capacity to different states. So right now, what you have is a very general Article 22, which sets out what the bank thinks are minimum conditions for public consultation. The details are not there, which the bank can help. Because you need to think about what constitutes the public in a project. How do you define the public? Let's take the two examples of the water project in South Africa and the petroleum exploration in the Amazon. How do you constitute the public? How do you determine how do you speak to them? Take an example. If you speak to for example, in the Amazon, where you have the different indigenous tribes, if you are consulting those groups, do you consult the traditional authorities, or do you consult everybody? How do you consult everybody? You have a town meeting. What language do you put the projects in? What nature of expertise is required to explain to ordinary Amazonians the nature of the impact of the project? It's a very detailed process. If people don't know what the project is about, how will they consult? How will they speak their mind? So if the bank were, for example, to provide a more detailed framework of the environmental and social framework to guide BRIC states in their implementation, that would go a long way. So I agree with Claudio that yes, the bank can advise, and that's one of my. I know that the bank cannot enforce, but the bank can advise, and that's my hope that the bank does more to advise member states as to how the environmental and social framework can be implemented.
We would love to see a situation where the consultation principle will be considered as binding as it should be, and the bank will not furnish the funding.
I'm not sure the bank has that political will to. I'm not sure the big states have that political will to make it binding. I don't think there is any political will to do so.
Okay. Any other raised hand? I can't see any. No. Any other question? No? Professor Nwauche, we are up to our time, and I just say thank you so much for your presence here. I appreciate a lot. Hope to have you here presentially in the next Congress. Hope to be
Thank
at
you. I look forward to that.
hope to be at for Hare in the near future. And
Yes.
please come as whenever you want. The word is yours to make the final remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Really fascinating to see how these linkages between the multilateral and the national can better improve. And, you know, as lawyers, we think about enforcement all the time. I like the last question of advice because it is supportive. And, you know, many of the big states would love that. The bank needs to be a little bit more engaged in its advisory capacity and to open up its processes to the public. We need to know what the bank does. We don't want to tell the bank what to do, but we need to know what it does when it lends money, because it deals with the technocrats in national capitals who do not know it all, even though they're members of the government. They don't know it all. They are guided by different political considerations, and very often considerations that don't benefit the general public. So thank you very much. This has been
We
very
thank you so
engaging
much.
process. Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right,
Thank
then.
you very much.
Bye. Thank you so
Bye,
much.
then. Bye.
I'll stop the recording right now. Eu vou desligar
No
a
problem.
gravação agora. Professor Nwauche, thank you. Hope to see you again very soon.
I hope so too.